The clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and welcome to the December 5 edition 2018 of Space News. This is Peter Out. I'm back this week and back with Michael Abdul and Angelo de Grazia from the Space Association. Good evening, gentlemen.
G'day, Peter. How you going?
Great.
Good evening. How are you all?
Good. All right, we're going to start off with a bit of homework. Due to some technical difficulties last week, we had to drop a couple of stories, and so we're going to dive back into those and read them for you tonight. First couple are Australian-based, so that's always good news. Black Sky Aerospace conducted Australia's first commercial rocket launch last week. Black Sky Aerospace, or BSA, a relatively unknown Brisbane-based aerospace company, conducted Australia's first ever launch carrying commercial payloads. The launch took place from the nation's only suborbital launch site near Goondiwindi, Queensland, 350 kilometres west of Brisbane. The suborbital launch of BSA's 5-metre-long Cyter 190 sounding rocket soared to approximately 20,000 feet, or 5,100 metres, and reached a maximum speed of Mach 1.2 in just a few seconds. The Cyter 190 rocket has a mass of 80 kilograms and is propelled by solid fuel consisting of aluminium, ammonium chloride and proprietary ingredients. The launch carried experimental payloads, including some for Hypersonics, another Australian launch startup developing the world's first hypersonic scramjet launch vehicle. Hypersonics tested sensor packages as well as a ceramic matrix composite panel, which the company plans to use for its own launch vehicles. The Cyter 190 also carried the Dek Unu 1, a device developed by Dek Unu Technologies used for skydivers. Dek Unu 1 is an enhanced altimeter that also has a 3D location tracker, flight analyzer and situational awareness tool that can gather flight data. Black Sky Aerospace is currently working on a range of suborbital rockets and is positioning itself as a suborbital payload delivery system provider. This first BSA/Hypersonics launch marks the beginning of Australia's commercial launch industry, while Equatorial Launch Australia is in the process of building Australia's first commercial orbital launch site near Nullambie in Northern Territory. So exciting times. I'll have to get up there and watch a few launches, gents. Okay, staying in Queensland, RUAG Space signs an agreement with Australian rocket company Gilmore Space. Another of Australia's leading rocket companies, Gilmore Space Technologies, has signed a long-term collaboration and supply agreement with the global launch industry supplier RUAG Space, headquartered in Bern, Switzerland. The agreement, the first of its kind in Australia, explores the use of RUAG Space's new range of flex-line carbon composite products in Gilmore Space's proprietary hybrid rockets. As previously reported here on Space News, the Queensland-based Gilmore Space company is targeting to launch small satellites weighing up to 100 kilograms to low Earth orbits from 2020 and up to 400 kilograms from 2021. RUAG Space has a long history of providing reliable launch technologies for rockets like the Ariane 5, Vega and Atlas, said Gilmore Space's CEO and founder Adam Gilmore. With this collaboration, we look to leverage on their proven expertise while lowering our launch development costs and time to market. Very exciting times. Angelo.
Okay, let's talk NASA news. Last week, NASA announced the selection of 9 companies eligible for future contracts to transport payloads to the moon. The companies, ranging in size from Lockheed Martin to small startups, were selected for NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services, or CLPS, program, under which NASA will buy payload space on commercial landers these companies will develop for scientific instruments and other payloads. Here are the 9 companies which have been selected to deliver these NASA payloads to the lunar surface. We've got Astrobotic, Deep Space Systems, Draper, Firefly Aerospace, Intuitive Machines, Lockheed Martin, Marston, Moon Express, and Orbit Beyond. Interesting that Blue Origin is not in that list, but continuing on. While the maximum value of all the contracts is $2.6 billion over 10 years, for now, each company will receive only a small amount of funding to develop a payload user's guide and will then be eligible to compete for task orders under the CLPS to fly those payloads. Finally, we're going back to the surface. That's a good news story. Going on to NASA Commercial Crew. NASA's administrator, Jim Bridenstine, is skeptical that SpaceX will be able to fly its first commercial crew demonstration mission in January. As we reported on last week's Space News, NASA announced only the week before last a target date of January 7 for the uncrewed test flight of the Crew Dragon spacecraft. However, last week, Bridenstine cautioned that the date is not firm and depends on upcoming reviews as well as other activities at the International Space Station. Then later in the week, Bridenstine told a group of reporters that the mission could slip until spring because of issues with the spacecraft's parachutes. Despite the potential delay, he said he still expected SpaceX and Boeing to be able to perform their uncrewed and crewed test flights before the end of next year. Bridenstine also says he personally ordered the safety reviews at Boeing and SpaceX that we reported on last week's show. He said the appearance of SpaceX's Elon Musk on a podcast where he briefly smoked marijuana and drank whiskey was not helpful, and that did not inspire confidence, arguing that the leaders of companies need to set an example given the importance of their job launching NASA astronauts. He added, though, that he had planned to seek a safety review even before Musk's podcast, saying safety issues in general were on his mind after reading the accident investigation reports for Apollo 1, Challenger and Columbia. Michael.
Okay, let's look at NASA, Lunar and Planetary. The success of 2 CubeSats flying with the InSight mission has raised the prospects of using them on future deep space missions. The twin Mars Cube 1 or MARCO CubeSats, intended to be technology demonstrations, worked as planned, relaying telemetry from InSight during entry, descent and landing on Mars last week. The prime mission for the CubeSats will continue for a further 2 weeks as they transmit other data collected during the flyby, while discussions for an extended mission are underway. The mission's chief engineer said that MARCO demonstrated technologies that could help future deep space CubeSat missions. Let's look at China. A Chinese tracking ship has left port to support the upcoming launch of China's next lunar mission. The Yuan Wang 7 space tracking vessel is headed to a point in the Pacific to provide downrange communications during the launch of the Chang'e 4 spacecraft, expected to take place on December 7. As previously reported here on Space News, that robotic spacecraft will travel to the moon and attempt a landing on the lunar far side around the beginning of 2019. Let's move to India. India successfully launched 31 satellites last week. India's Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle, or PSLV, lifted off on schedule from the Satish Dhawan Space Centre and initially deployed its primary payload, the HISIS Hyperspectral Imaging Satellite. Then the spacecraft manoeuvred to a lower orbit to deploy 30 smallsat secondary payloads, including satellites for Black Sky, Planet, Spire, and a number of other smallsat startups, including Australia's Fleet Space Technologies, Kepler Communications and Hyber, which are all targeting the Internet of Things market. Fleet and Kepler are planning constellations of 100 or more, and the 2 companies have now a combined 5 satellites in orbit. You'll recall that Fleet's first satellites were launched on last month's launch of Rocket Lab's Electron rocket from New Zealand.
Excellent. All right, some South Korean news now. South Korea successfully tested an engine to be used on a small launch vehicle it is developing. Boy, this small launch vehicle market's getting very crowded. The launch powered a suborbital rocket that lifted off last week from the Nauru Space Center. The engine fired for 151 seconds, exceeding the goal of 140 seconds, and sent the rocket to a peak altitude of more than 200 kilometers before splashing down nearly 430 kilometers downrange. The engine tested on that flight will be used on South Korea's KS-LV-2 launch vehicle, expected to make its first flight in 2021. Mike, back to you.
Okay, let's look at commercial general. Launch companies are reducing the number of vehicle options to lower their costs. United Launch Alliance once offered 41 different versions of its Atlas and Delta rockets, changing the payload fairing, upper stage and number of strap-on boosters. The company has reduced that number to 18 and will ultimately have only 4 versions of the Vulcan Centaur when it enters service in the 2020s. Blue Origin, meanwhile, will fly only a single version of its New Glenn rocket, saying that the cost savings through such standardisation makes it worth even launching the rocket half empty. Meanwhile, 3 small launch vehicle companies say they're planning first orbital launches next year. During a panel session at the Spacecom Expo last week in Houston, Texas, representatives of Firefly Aerospace, Vector and Virgin Orbit said they expected to make their first launches to orbit in 2019, ranging from early in the year for Virgin Orbit to December 2019 for Firefly. The companies argued that, amid concerns about too many launch vehicles chasing too few satellites, that their vehicles are complementary, serving different segments of the small sat market. And in what appears to be more small sat news, Space Florida is working on a deal to bring a small launch company to the state. At a board meeting last week, the State Space Development Agency said it's negotiating with an unnamed company to set up manufacturing and launch operations on the Space Coast, an effort called Project Maricopa. The board approved plans to offer up to $18 million in infrastructure upgrades for the company, which would invest $52 million of its own money in facilities there and create 239 jobs. Angelo.
Okay, to SpaceX news. A Federal Communications Commission license application has offered new insights into plans by SpaceX to test its next-generation launch vehicle. The application for an experimental communications license filed by SpaceX with the FCC recently discussed plans to test an unnamed vertical takeoff, vertical landing vehicle at its South Texas launch site under development. That's in Boca Chica near Brownsville. The tests would involve a mix of low-altitude tests, flying to no more than 500 metres before landing, and high-altitude tests where it would go to as high as 5,000 metres. SpaceX is also seeking an experimental permit from the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation for the flights. The application doesn't name the vehicle, but SpaceX previously has said it plans to perform hot tests of what is now called Starship at its Texas site starting late next year. Exciting indeed. Peter.
All right, well, finishing off this week, we've got some Virgin Orbit news. They performed the first captive carry flight of its Launcher One system recently. As we anticipated in the last episode of Space News, the company's Boeing 747 aircraft took off from an airport in Victorville, California, with a Launcher One rocket attached to its left wing and flew for nearly 90 minutes. Virgin Orbit said this flight, the first by this plane to carry a rocket, was picture perfect, quote unquote. Virgin Orbit plans several captive carry flights to collect aerodynamics and structural data, culminating in a test where the rocket is released in flight but does not ignite its engines. Virgin Orbit says it now expects a first orbital mission of Launcher 1 to take place early in 2019. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you, gentlemen, and it's back to you, Andrew.